10 Commandments of Geopolitics. Welcome to Geopolitics Demystified. I'm your host, S.L. Canthan. Today we'll talk about the 10 Commandments of Geopolitics that every country should know. Number 1, thou shalt have a strong economy. If you're poor, you're not going to have any geopolitical power. So, in the best case scenario, a country should have a huge GDP along with a big GDP per capita and a huge middle class population and not too much inequality. So, that would be an ideal situation. And then the key is to sustain the economic growth and prosperity. It's not easy. For example, if you look at many Latin American countries, they used to be pretty good, pretty prosperous in the 1970s, and then they declined. And you can see what is happening in Europe right now. They've had a decade that's lost, just like Japan went through in the 1990s. So Japan's GDP today is the same as it was 30 years ago. And Europe is going to be on the same path if they don't make radical changes. And as for the poor countries, it's very hard to get out of the poverty cycle. A lot of the poor countries or the developing countries or the emerging economies or the global south, whatever term you want to use, they have been stuck in poverty. Very, very few developing countries have become developed countries. And a lot of them, they get into the debt trap. They go to the IMF and the World Bank for debt. And then those institutions, they basically work on behalf of the US empire and the Western nations. And then they force so-called reforms on these countries. And then it's a matter of privatization, austerity, shock therapy, shock doctrine, and then they're just ruined forever. And then the politicians in those countries are also easily corrupted. So that's a big problem. And then these countries, they stay poor. And when a country stays poor, its people and natural resources get exploited, right? So the countries would come to, if you go back to China in the 1980s and 90s, and right now in, say, Bangladesh, Vietnam, India, and so on, the Western corporations, they come and they make people work for $1 an hour for a product that they could sell for thousands of dollars, whether it's an iPhone or a Gucci bag, right? So that is just blatant exploitation. And in, for example, if you take the African countries, there's a lot of exploitation by Western corporations from the Netherlands, France, UK, US, Canada. They all go to Africa and they get to mine natural resources, and they would get something like for $1, and then they would resell it for $100 or $200 in the market. And poverty and inequality are huge problems around the world. For example, 750 million people in the world, they don't have access to electricity. 1 in 3 in the world do not have access to the internet. 5 billion people in the world have never even attended a high school. 1 in 3 do not have access to safe drinking water. And 4 out of 5 people in the world have never flown in an airplane, right? So these are huge problems that is not easy to solve. And then if your economy is bad, then the country experiences brain drain, meaning that all the smart people, they leave the country to go to the US, UK, Australia, whatever, seeking better jobs, better pay, better life. And then that makes the developing countries even worse off because now they've lost all the smart people, and then it's going to be much harder to fix the problems. And then in some cases, when the people go to the Western countries, they study economics and they get good jobs with the Western institutions or the IMF and the World Bank. And then they get brainwashed by neoliberalism. And then when they come back to their countries, they're going to do more harm because they're going to follow the recipes provided by the Western countries, whose goal is to keep the rest of the world down. And then if your economy is not doing well, there's going to be more crime, maybe protests, or maybe even separatism, terrorism, or even a civil war. Right. So if you look at Latin America, there are a lot of drug cartels because people find that to be the easiest way to make money. And then that brings down the whole country. And the effects of the economy are now even seen in Europe. For example, there's a lot of rise in the far right populism, and there have been some countries like Spain where separatists want to leave Spain, like in the Basque, Catalan. And why does that happen? Because of the economy. If the economy is not doing well, then you're going to have internal division. And we might see that in the US as well. You know, the rise of Trump, make America great again, that word again uh, indicates that America is not great anymore, right? And the middle class people, the working class people, they've suffered a lot over the last 20 years. And then if the economy is not strong, the country might be vulnerable to color revolution. The US can come and spend a few $1 million and they can just overthrow the leaders. So that's a problem. For example, in Syria, the US and NATO supported jihadists from all over the world. And these people, they get paid like maybe $150 a month, and they're willing to die for, jihadism. And that's what happens when the economy is not strong, or if we'll see in the next section, so if the intelligence is not strong, then other countries can cause havoc. And if your country is rich, on the other hand, it can gain a lot of geopolitical power. It can gain diplomatic power by giving aid and loans to other countries, building infrastructure in other countries, like China's Belt and Road Initiative, where they have 150 member countries and regions. So then China can build its geopolitical power without wars and destruction. So that comes with prosperity. So, for example, China has spent $3 trillion over the last 2 decades in terms of the ODI, which is the outward direct investment. Like the foreign direct investment, the ODI goes outside. And China has spent $3 trillion building up its geopolitical muscle all over the world. So that's the first commandment. Thou shalt have a strong economy. The second commandment is, thou shalt have a strong military. This should be a no-brainer. for thousands of years, geopolitics was pretty Darwinian. Whatever king or the emperor was around the world, he had to have a strong military. And if his military was weak, he was beaten up by the neighboring king, and that was the end of it, right? So now the world is a little bit better. It's less Darwinian. We have some system like the UN and so on, but still, it is chaotic in the big picture. Look at how the US is waging proxy wars against Russia, and then Europe also joined it. And then the US has been waging all kinds of hybrid wars against China. And now we see what is happening in the Middle East. So why was Israel able to defeat Hamas? Because Hamas doesn't have a military, right? They don't have tanks, they don't have fighter jets, they don't have missile defense systems. So they get beaten up very easily. And same thing to a different extent with Hezbollah. But in terms of Iran, it's able to fight back a little bit. So that's why the US and Israel are not able to attack Iran very easily. But look what happened to Iraq, Libya. They were totally destroyed because they didn't have strong enough military. And so now we are, seeing the endless wars, perpetual wars, but for different reasons or the excuses as the societies have seen over thousands of years. So the only people who can survive without a strong military are the vassals, like, say, Japan, Germany, South Korea. They depend on the US military, but then the flip side is they lose sovereignty. So they're not great geopolitical powers because they don't have their own military, they don't have sovereignty. So you need a strong military. And these days, what's also important is that the country should have independent weapons. They should be able to produce, manufacture their own fighter jets, their own tanks, their own submarines, their own warships. Because if you just buy your weapons from other countries, then you are dependent on those countries. And if you buy a fighter jet from the US, and if you buy missiles from the US, you cannot even launch them without the approval of the US. So you have to get a special code from the US to start your fighter jet, and the US will determine who you can use the fighter jet against. So that's commandment number 2 is thou shalt have a strong military and an independent foreign policy. Commandment number 3, thou shalt secure your food and natural resources, right? Food security is so basic. If you are not able to feed your population, especially during wartime, then you can never go to war. And then the sanctions can totally crush your economy and your country. So you need food security. And if you're not able to produce 100% of your own food, you should have reliable and guaranteed friends and allies who will ship the food even during difficult times or war times. And of course, if you can actually export food, that's also a lot of geopolitical power. As we've seen Russia under Putin. In 1999, Russia was really suffering. from lack of enough food. The agriculture sector was totally destroyed in the 1990s by Wall Street. And then Putin came and saved Russia. And now Russia exports more wheat than the US. And that gives a huge geopolitical power because there are going to be a lot of countries who are dependent on your food, and then they're going to be nice to you, right? And then the same thing for natural resources. If you can export whatever other countries need, it may be oil, gas, iron ore, copper, lithium, timber, cobalt, nickel, whatever it is. If you can export it and if you have control over your mines, then that's great, right? Because if you look at a lot of the African countries, they have plenty of natural resources. So theoretically, they should be very, very rich, but they're not rich. Why? Because all their mines are controlled by foreigners. Then what's the point in having all those natural resources? So that's number 2. Commandment number 3, thou shalt have strong finance. So finance is almost rocket science. Okay, so people, the governments have to maintain their currency so it remains strong. They have to control the inflation so it's not too high. And sometimes they have to worry about deflation. That's not good either. And then number 3, they have to control their debt, and especially the external debt, right? So if a country borrows in a dollar, then they're going to be at a huge risk, because if they cannot pay back the dollar debt, then the US empire is going to descend upon that country like a vulture. And they would say you would have to privatize everything. And then BlackRock and other financial institutions are going to buy everything for pennies on the dollar. They will buy land, they will buy natural resources, they will buy banks, corporations, media, right? And then you lose your whole country, and then you can never recover. So those are some of the biggest challenges for a developing country. And then for whether it's a developed country or a developing country, rich or a poor country, how to run the economy is a challenge. It's not easy, right? What is the role of the government? What is the role of the private enterprises? There has to be some balance between those two. And there should be some wall of separation as well, because else it'll be like the US, where all the politicians are bought and paid for by the oligarchs and the big corporations. And that's bad for the country. So in China, for example, there are a lot of millionaires, and there are about 1,000 billionaires. But those billionaires are strictly under the government, right? They may have a lot of friends in the government, but eventually the government says, no, we are more powerful than you billionaires, and you guys have to do what is good for the country, right? So Xi Jinping, for example, talks a lot about common prosperity. And that's important, whether you consider that as socialism or communism. You can have that in capitalism too. Capitalist countries can have a strong government that worries about what's good for the country and in the long term. So in the US and Europe, the government embraced deregulation and neoliberalism starting in the 1980s with the Reagan in the US and the Thatcher in the UK. And what happened? Those countries got totally deindustrialized. They just shut down all the steel factories, the automotive factories, And it was all about profit, profit, profit. And it became a parasitic system. And they just destroyed themselves over the last 40 years. So you have to worry about that, the balance between the government and free market. And then you have to build stock markets. You have to encourage the entrepreneurism. So you need a lot of smart people who take risk, who are innovative, who are creative, but within a balance, right? Because you don't want a society that becomes like Las Vegas. So if you go to Las Vegas, what is it? They don't have farming, they don't have manufacturing. All they do is casino. It's the extractive. Then they have, prostitution, drugs, gambling. It's not a sustainable model for a whole country. Maybe one city can work like that. And if you look at how Putin revived Russia over the last 25 years, there is a lot for other countries to learn because Putin made the government strong. He created good public-private partnership. So some of these people could make billions of dollars, but then they have to share their profits with the government. And these guys have to stay patriotic. So that's a good balance. And China's success story over the last 40 years is also amazing. So their GDP per capita grew 60-fold, 60-fold in the last 40 years. And China is on the verge of becoming a developed nation. It's just a matter of the strength of yuan. If the PBOC, the Bank of China, the People's Bank of China, lets the yuan become a little bit stronger, like say 6.7 yuan per dollar, then China will be considered a developed nation. And of course, if you go to places, cities like Shenzhen, Shanghai, Beijing, you would say that China is a developed nation and is actually more advanced than the US or Europe. So that is commandment number 3. Thou shalt have a very smart finance. Number 4 is thou shalt manage your geopolitical alliances. So every country must figure out its friends and foes, who to be friends with, who to be enemies with. Well, ideally, a country should have no enemy, right? That's the smartest way to have a strategic autonomy, try to be friends with everybody, try to trade with everyone, and then you benefit from each country in a different way. And then if there are conflicts, every country should think about the future, right? So if, for example, the US is number 1 right now, and then if somebody analyzes the trends of the world, like de-dollarization, the debt problem in the US, the inequality problem, the polarization, and then they may look at China, and then they may say, okay, China and BRICS, that's the future, so I'm going to hedge, right? I'm not going to put all the eggs in the American basket. So that would be a smart way to manage your alliances based on the current situation as well as a very smart estimate of the future. And every country should try to have friends all around it. Because if you have friends, neighboring countries that are not your friends, and if you don't have peaceful relations with all the boundary countries, then you're in big trouble, right? So the first step is to secure your border and become a sort of a regional power, and then you can try to be a global power. And Take Ukraine, for example. They made terrible geopolitical decision. They should have been friends with Russia because Russia is a neighboring country. And instead, they started a war with the neighboring country based on the money and the weapons from far, far away countries like the US. So Ukraine is a sacrificial pawn that is dying on behalf of the US empire, which is thousands of miles away on the other side of the globe. That was a very dumb mistake. And look at Europe. Europe was also a pawn of the globalist bankers. So Europe started a war in World War One. They didn't learn a lesson. So they did World War II and they destroyed themselves. And then they got occupied by the US and NATO. And then after about 80 years, they have forgotten all their history and they're starting a war with Russia again. And they're doing the same mistake and they're weakening themselves, right? And then they're also forced to get millions of refugees from all the countries that the US bombs. What a terrible, terrible geopolitical mistake, right? So they failed that commandment. The next commandment, thou shalt have a strong, robust infrastructure, right? If you want to get rich, build a road. That's a Chinese proverb, right? And it's basically about infrastructure because in those days, they didn't have seaports, railways, airports, and all of that. So now, if you want to get rich, you need to build roads, highways, railways, seaports, airports, telecom infrastructure. You should have cities where people have running water and clean water. People should have electricity 24/7, gas, internet, TV, cable, smartphone, mobile networks, sewage, good ways to manage traffic, right? Those all come under infrastructure, and those are all basics. And if you can't have those, you cannot have a strong country, you cannot be a geopolitical power. And then there's also soft infrastructure, which is like, say, schools, universities, hospitals, police, art, theater, temples and churches, parks, museums, sports facilities. All of those are important in having a good country. And then you also have to worry about the environment, right? So you have to worry about pollution in the air, pollution of the soil, pollution of the water. So those have to be balanced with growth, how to grow. So you have to look at the green energy, have more solar panels, have more wind turbines, build the fourth generation of nuclear power plants, use natural gas more, and plant trees, right? So China has planted literally tens of billions of trees over the last few decades. And that should be done by every country. And then they have to plan how to manage their rivers and lakes, how to capture the rainwater. For example, like in India, most of the monsoon rains water, they go back into the ocean, right? So we should be building lakes and reservoirs all over India to capture the rainwater and to solve the problems with groundwater. Like in Bangalore, sometimes people have to drill like 1,000 feet to get water. Right? So the infrastructure is the next commandment. And then thou shalt have sovereign technology. So technology is key, is like really underpins everything, right? We talked about military, and that's basically about technology. And if you look at the history, how did Europeans manage to colonize almost the rest of the world? It was because they had better technology. They had guns, they had steel industry, they had coal industry, and they had all these innovations. Right? That was with telephones and all sorts of things. And how did the U.S. win World War II so easily at the end? It was because of the atomic bomb technology. So, if you want to be a geopolitical power, then you should have very strong technology. Look around your home now. Most of the technology originate in the US, right? We are using Zoom, we're using Microsoft, Windows, laptops with the Intel chips and Qualcomm chips and Micron chips. So all these are, all the software we use, right? Google, Amazon, blah, blah, blah. Where is the cloud computing? It all came from the US. And there's only one country that is developing whatever that the US was able to do, and that is China. So China said, we are going to have our own Google. We are going to have our own Amazon e-commerce. We are going to have our own cloud computing. We're going to have our own AI, own quantum computing. And now they are developing their own semiconductor ecosystem. And they're now at something like 7 nanometers. And if they can break it through to say 5 nanometers and 3 nanometers, then it's game over. Then the US has no more geopolitical power over China. Then China will be the same as the US in terms of technology. And then what happens? China is better at manufacturing. So they'll be able to scale. They'll be able to do the same chips as the US, but half the price. So China will totally decimate the US empire once China fully catches on with technology. Okay. And then what's next? Thou shalt have your own smart media and entertainment. So this is also very key. Right now, the US has tremendous control over the global media. If you look at the influence of all the US mainstream media, like CNN, Wall Street Journal, Fortune, Forbes, New York Times, Washington Post, Time, Newsweek, blah, 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 hundreds of magazines, and they control the book publications. And then they also have social media, right? All the things, Twitter, Facebook, Instagram, Substack, Medium. So they can Reddit. So they control all these social media where the mainstream media news gets magnified. So they control the source, and then they also control the distribution of the information. So if you want to be a strong geopolitical power, you should have your own media, you should have your own social media, you should have your own think tanks, independent think tanks, who are not just going to regurgitate the US talking points. Like if you look at Europe, Europe has no sovereignty, right? There's not one single mainstream media in Europe that's going to challenge the US empire, that is going to challenge what is happening in the Middle East or what is happening in Ukraine. Not a single mainstream media in Europe is going to talk about the neo-Nazis in Ukraine, how the U.S. Goal is to drive a wedge between Germany and Russia, to disrupt the rise of Eurasia so that the US can keep controlling Europe, right? It's a very simple message, the simple fact that the US wants to keep Europe weak. But there's not any European mainstream media, any politician in power, any think tank who are going to say those, right? If you look at, say, the Atlantic Council or other think tanks in Europe, they're all controlled by NATO, and then NATO is controlled by the US. So you don't have sovereignty. You're going to stay a vassal, a puppet state with no backbone if you're not able to control your media and you're not able to control the minds of your people, and not in a bad way, but to educate your people. If you're not able to control the information your people are consuming, then your people are going to be consuming the propaganda from other countries. And that propaganda is not in the best interest of your own country. So that is a geopolitical commandment. And then the ninth commandment is, thou shalt have a meritocratic system, right? So this is key. Your politicians should be the smartest people, not the ones who have the best slogans, not the ones who say crazy things to get votes, not a politician who cannot point out to Ukraine on a map, but he approves the bill for sending $100 billion to Ukraine, right? So if you don't have bureaucrats who are smart and independent, like if you look at the US, the FDA, the SEC, and all these other federal bureaucrats, the bureaucracies, they're all captured by the corporations that these agencies are supposed to monitor and regulate. So that's not meritocracy. That's total corruption. And that's not even capitalism. It's a totally a rigged, corrupt system where politicians are bought by the corporations, and then these politicians, they literally let the lobbyists write the laws. And then they just get a bill that's like 1,000 pages long. So no US politician is going to read that, and then they just approve. And what happens? It's terrible, right? So whatever, if you want to be a geopolitical power, you need to be ruthlessly meritocratic, really smart and able people at all levels, local levels, provincial levels, federal levels. People have to be very smart and very dedicated and very logical, and they do what's good for the country in the short term, medium term, and the long term, and they can view things objectively. They're not captured by the oligarchs, right? So that is very key. And the last and the 10th commandment is, thou shalt have a smart and spiritual population. So this is key. And so the first step is you need a well-educated population, right? So there should be a large segment of the population, pretty much everyone should graduate from high school. That should be the first goal. And then, I don't know, maybe 25, 30% should go to college, and they should and then another maybe 5%, they do master's and PhD, and not just in fluff topics, right? They shouldn't be getting their PhD in women's studies, right? Instead, they should be studying STEM, right? Science, technology, engineering, math, hardcore, physics, chemistry. And this requires really smart people who uh, love their work. They're not just doing it for money, but they really enjoy knowledge, and they should have a good social status. So people should say, wow, you're a scientist, and not, wow, you're a basketball player. You are so much better than a scientist, right? A society that worships movie stars and sports athletes and people on social media who say dumb things, or pornography, stupidity, degeneracy. That kind of society has no future. So you need to have a good, solid society where people take care of their health and mind. They're willing to help others, to help the poor people. They spend time in community services, and they love reading good, long intellectual articles. They watch good YouTube channels like this one, and not some stupid channels about degeneracy or stupid, mindless entertainment. They shouldn't be drinking too much. They shouldn't be doing drugs. They should take care of their health. Right? So, a very wholesome society. And obviously, you cannot have 100% of the people like that, but that should be the mainstream, right? So the mainstream society should be normal, wholesome, intellectual, uh, spiritual, maybe religious, but not too religious, so they become fanatics. So moderately religious, and they participate in the welfare of the society. So if you have that kind of population, then your country will be a great geopolitical power. So that's the end. Those are the 10 commandments of geopolitics. Now, please leave a comment in the video about how your country ranks in each of these commandments. Thank you, and cheers for now. See you next week.